This weir at Cromwell Lock is the tidal limit of the River Trent. Tide water from the North Sea pours into and out of the Humber estuary, and when the high tide is at its maximum, it fills the Trent to this point. But Cromwell Lock is a long way from the Humber estuary, some 70 kilometres along the river, in fact. This map shows the valley of the Trent from source to mouth. It starts quite near to the Dee estuary on the west coast of England, and then flows in a great arc through central England before reaching the sea. In this programme, we shall be looking at one quite short reach of the Trent, from Newark to Clifton, and at part of the Dove, one of the main tributaries which flows into the north side of the river. In particular, we shall examine some of the major relief features in the two sections and the impact man has had upon the river channels and the valleys in which they occur. We begin our study in the tidal part of the Trent, just north of Cromwell Lock and the weir we saw a few moments ago. Here, the Trent is some 50 metres wide. The water is flowing sluggishly between high banks. Beyond the banks is a level plain. Look at the rail bridge and the supports needed to hold up the bridge and keep it above the surrounding land. These supports are needed to prevent the railway from being flooded. Although flooding is obviously a problem for the farmer, the valley floor produces rich pastures. The Trent is a big river, as indeed it should be, since it drains most of central England. And when it floods, it really floods. The water comes over the banks, deposits mud, builds them higher and higher, and then man comes along and artificially raises the embankment, or the levee as it's called, in an attempt to contain all this mass of flood water. But he can't always stop it. And when the Trent floods, the water comes flowing over here and occupies the whole of this floodplain, as it's called, the low-lying land between the river and that ridge there. And on the occasions when the Trent has really flooded, it's had 3 major floods since the war, all of this area between the river and right up to that ridge is covered in water. Well, of course, early man knew about that too. That's why the villages aren't built on the riverside. They're built over there, where you can see that church. They're built on that ridge, which protects them from being flooded, even in the worst possible floods. This map shows Clifton Church, the one we just saw on that small ridge, and the road running along the ridge towards Newark. Notice the line of villages, including Besthorpe, North and South Collingham, and Winthorpe. The ridge on which the road has been built is a natural river terrace. Several terrace levels have been detected in the Trent Valley. They run along the riverside, sometimes following the present course of the river, sometimes running in straight lines where the river is twisting and bending. These terraces mark the lines of former routes of the river. They are clear reminders that a river does not always follow the same route. The Trent, as we can see, is full of meanders. We shall explain the way a river alters its route later. For the moment, we'll keep our attention on the floodplain of the Trent, especially in the flat area between the river and the first terrace line. Because of the regular flooding, it is difficult to use this land for profitable purposes. Most profit comes from digging into the floodplain and removing the surface materials. The Middle Trent Valley is one of the most important areas of gravel working in Britain. The gravels are found beneath a layer of alluvium. This alluvium, or river mud, has been deposited by the Trent. The gravels were also deposited by the river soon after the period when Britain was covered by great sheets of ice. The gravels are of glacial origin and are removed by these excavators. 95% of the gravels are quartzite pebbles. The pebbles and the alluvial deposits are removed together. The pebbles are separated from the sand and transported by conveyor belt to the loading wharf. There they are loaded into barges carrying from 200 to 500 tons. The gravel beds here are excavated to a depth of 6 metres. As the gravels are removed, the holes left are below the river level and they fill with river water. The flooded workings, which can be dangerous, become extensive lagoons. Although they are industrial scars, attempts are made by gravel companies to turn them into useful amenities for the local community. Some of the larger lagoons are used for sailing and water skiing. Others have become small nature reserves since they attract uncommon species of birds. The gravels are used for concrete aggregate and in road building. The barges sail down the Trent to Hull, where they're unloaded. In this air view, we can see a barge sailing along the river. This barge is in fact not a gravel barge, this one is carrying oil. From the sea upstream to Newark, there is a navigable channel 2 metres deep, which is kept clear by dredging. The channel permits vessels of a standard size. In 1975, the figures were 25.35 metres length, 5.25 metres beam, and 1.8 metres draft to reach the quays at Newark after passing through only one lock, the one at Cromwell Weir. The weir was rebuilt in 1959 to replace the one breached by floods in 1955. This barge is approaching Trent Bridge at Newark. Approximately 750,000 tons of goods per annum are carried by barge between Nottingham and the mouth of the Trent, 400,000 tons being of gravel, the rest oil and general cargoes. At Newark, there are quays, workshops, warehouses, and a dry dock. From the air, water channels dominate the Newark scene. Water channels and bridges. Today, Newark, which is 32 kilometres northeast of Nottingham, is principally an engineering centre, with the two major employers of labour being a ball-bearing firm and a firm producing pumps and compressors. Newark's association with the rural surroundings can be seen in the open marketplace, one of the largest cobbled squares in the country.
Where they go, run down there.
The castle, commanding the river crossing, dates back to the mid-12th century. The bridging point explains the original siting of the town. Even in Roman times, when this town stood on the intersection of the Roman Fosse Way and Sewston Lane, a prehistoric trackway, the river crossing was important in the national system of communications. Between Dunham and Newark, we have seen that the Trent is a navigable waterway. The river flows slowly along an almost level course between high banks. Levees and flood barriers run along the banks, and then there is a wide flood plain. All along the flood plain, there are valuable gravel deposits. A gravel terrace, most noticeable on the eastern bank, has been used as a site for settlements on the main road. Now let's look at some different valley scenery. A major tributary entering the Middle Trent is the Dove. You can see this river flowing in a northwest to southeast direction. Between Roster and the confluence of the Dove and the Trent, there is far less evidence of man's work on the river and the valley floor. From this viewpoint, we can see the River Dove flowing in a wide valley. Here it has a meandering course. It winds its way in a series of broad loops across a flat valley floor. Here is a good example of a single meander seen near Tutbury. We're looking northwards across the valley so the Dove is flowing from left to right as we look at it. If we look at the river more closely, we can see its distinctive features. As the river swings into the bend, although it is moving quite slowly because of the low gradient of the valley floor, it erodes, eats away into the bank. Here we see that the river bank drops vertically to the river. In some places, where the river meander is near to bluffs or small hills on the valley floor, river cliffs, that is, steep, vertical, muddy banks, can be seen. On the opposite bank, the erosive action of the river is less powerful, and instead of a river cliff, we find an area where mud and shingle are deposited to form a slip-off slope. You can see how soft and muddy these deposits are. In this view, looking upstream, you can see the two different kinds of banks: deposition on one side, erosion on the other. Now let's return to a view of a whole meander. In this diagram, the arrows show the movement of the river water. It's clear that on this meander, the river is eroding mainly at the 4 points marked by the letter E. And the main deposition is occurring at the points marked D. As the erosion continues, the neck of the meander is narrowed. The points are brought closer and closer together until they meet. When they meet, the force of river water results in a straightening of the river channel, and the loop is left isolated as a lake. This abandoned meander is called an oxbow lake. Sometimes the lake dries out, filling with water only at times of heavy rain or when flooding from the main river occurs. The line of the abandoned meander is shown by a line of trees. Here, at Dove Bridge, near Marston-on-Dove, we can see a good example of an oxbow lake where the Dove has changed its course. Well, as you can see, standing here in this field, the River Dove is in front of me. But not so long ago, if I'd been standing on the same spot, the river would have been behind me, because that's the course it used to follow. It came down there and then swung round in a great arc down to there. And then in the course of time, the river cut through the narrow neck, leaving this strip now, which is full of swampy woods, as an oxbow lake, a meander of the river which has now been abandoned. Well, that's an example of rivers changing their course naturally, but of course man can take a hand. Only a few yards away there's an example of that. Because here the river used to flow along there, but now it's been dammed up and diverted along this channel here. It rejoins the old course of the river further down. And the reason they've done this is because they want to construct a weir to enable them to measure the flow of water down the river and to clean it and to purify it before it reaches the pumping station down the stream. At various points along the Dove, measuring gauges have been placed along the banks and in the river. The information obtained from these gauges helps in controlling floods along the Trent. A good indication of the levels of floodwater reached in the worst years is provided at Trent Bridge in Nottingham, where lines showing the levels reached and the dates have been cut into the stonework. The most recent severe flooding was in 1947, when the river rose 3.64 metres above the normal level here. This flooding caused enormous damage to Nottingham, but the city itself has not again been flooded due to the introduction of a flood protection scheme by the River Authority. A major study has also been undertaken by the Hydraulics Research Station at Wallingford in Berkshire. A large-scale model of the Trent and the valley on both sides of Nottingham has been built here. By using this model, it is possible to examine the effects of variable levels of water upon different techniques of flood control. Flooding is one problem which is being overcome. Another problem on the Trent is water pollution. The Trent, from Stoke to Burton, has had a reputation for being badly polluted. But the Dove is a source of clean water, and so this water is welcomed by river authorities. It is also welcomed by anglers along the Trent, where increasingly, due to improved pollution control, salmon are to be found. Water has long been a source of power. Before the Industrial Revolution, river water was harnessed to drive water wheels in the small mills, like this one on a small tributary of the Dove. These mills ground corn, or manufactured wool, or produced simple agricultural implements. Although water wheels like this are no longer used, water is still needed in modern power stations. On the banks of the Trent, north of Cromwell Lock, where we began this programme, is the largest power station in our study areas. This is the High Marnham Power Station. Here, water is pumped from the river and is used to raise steam, which drives the generators which produce the electricity. The steam is converted back into water in those massive cooling towers. This water is then returned to the river. Just as it is important to obtain clean water from the river, so it is important to ensure that effluent into the river doesn't contain materials which might harm plant, fish, and other natural life dependent on the river. In this programme, we've seen two stretches of meandering rivers. The Dove Valley between Roster and the confluence with the Trent is a virtually unspoiled rural section in which meanders and abandoned meanders can be clearly seen in a wide floodplain. Between Newark and Dunham, the Trent is seen as a wide, sluggish river meandering in a broad floodplain. In comparison with the Dove, it is an industrialised river, with the main characteristics being flood control, navigation, gravel extraction, and electricity production. Despite the industrialisation, the major relief features associated with the mature stage of a river can still be seen. In seeking to manage the river, to make it useful while keeping its best natural features, man has a difficult task, especially since the river alters its course and all too frequently floods.